The question of why many Muslim-majority countries are relatively poor compared to other nations is a complex issue rooted in a variety of historical, political, economic, and social factors. It's important to acknowledge from the outset that not all Muslim-majority countries are poor. Nations such as Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia have immense wealth due to their oil resources. However, when you look at the broader Muslim world, including countries like Yemen, Afghanistan, and Sudan, the prevalence of poverty is more apparent. Understanding why requires peeling back layers of history and examining a range of contributing factors that go far beyond religion itself. Historically, many Muslim-majority countries were centers of thriving trade and intellectual innovation. Cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Damascus were once the beating hearts of the ancient world, hubs of commerce, art, and science. The Islamic Golden Age, from the 8th to the 14th centuries, saw significant advancements in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. However, several historical events halted this momentum. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century, European colonialism in the 19th and 20th centuries, and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the early 20th century all played roles in the economic decline of the Muslim world. The legacy of colonialism in particular left many Muslim-majority countries with artificial borders, political instability, and economies structured to benefit colonial powers rather than local populations. One key factor in the poverty of many Muslim-majority countries is the legacy of colonial exploitation. European colonial powers, particularly Britain and France, carved up the Middle East, Africa, and parts of Asia into territories that often disregarded ethnic, tribal, and religious divisions. These colonial powers extracted resources from these regions, whether it was oil, minerals, or agricultural products, without building sustainable local economies. By the time these countries gained independence in the mid-20th century, they were often left with weak institutions, fragile economies, and little infrastructure to support long-term development. The case of Algeria, colonized by France for over 130 years, is one example. When Algeria finally gained independence in 1962 after a brutal war, it was left with significant social and economic scars, many of which persist today. Another major issue is the reliance on natural resources, particularly oil, which is a double-edged sword for many Muslim countries. The so-called resource curse refers to the paradox that countries rich in natural resources like oil or minerals often struggle with economic instability and slower growth. This happens because resource wealth can lead to corruption, mismanagement, and a lack of investment in other sectors of the economy. In oil-rich nations like Saudi Arabia or Iraq, vast oil revenues have not always translated into widespread prosperity for the general population. Instead, wealth often concentrates in the hands of a small elite, while the broader economy remains underdeveloped. Additionally, the dependence on oil makes these countries highly vulnerable to fluctuations in global oil prices. When prices are high, economies boom, but when prices crash, as they did in 2014, the effects can be devastating. Political instability has also played a significant role in stunting economic growth in many Muslim-majority countries. Civil wars, military coups, and authoritarian regimes are all too common in the Middle East, Africa, and parts of South Asia. The Arab Spring, which began in 2010, was a clear indicator of the widespread dissatisfaction with political systems in countries like Egypt, Libya, and Syria. Decades of dictatorship, corruption, and economic stagnation led to mass uprisings. However, the aftermath has been mixed, with some countries descending into further chaos. Libya, for example, has been torn apart by rival factions since the fall of Muammar Gaddafi, while Syria has been engulfed in a brutal civil war that has displaced millions and devastated the economy. Wars and conflicts have taken an enormous toll on the Muslim world, draining resources, destroying infrastructure, and displacing millions of people. Afghanistan, one of the poorest countries in the world, has been in a near-constant state of war since the Soviet invasion in 1979, followed by civil war, the rise of the Taliban, and the US-led invasion after 9/11. Decades of violence have left the country with minimal infrastructure, widespread poverty, and little hope for economic recovery in the near term. Yemen, another country ravaged by conflict, has been suffering through a civil war since 2015, with millions of people facing famine and a collapsed economy. These conflicts not only devastate economies in the short term, but leave long-lasting scars that take generations to heal. A major economic challenge for many Muslim-majority countries is the lack of diversification. Even outside the oil-rich nations, many of these countries rely heavily on one or two industries, often in agriculture or raw materials. This lack of diversification makes them highly vulnerable to external shocks, whether it's a drop in commodity prices, climate change, or shifts in global trade patterns. Pakistan, for example, is heavily dependent on agriculture, but recurring floods and poor infrastructure have kept the country from developing a more diversified and resilient economy. As a result, millions of people remain trapped in poverty, with little opportunity to improve their living standards. Corruption is another pervasive issue. Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index consistently ranks many Muslim-majority countries among the most corrupt in the world. Corruption erodes trust in government institutions, stifles investment, and hampers economic development. In countries like Iraq, Nigeria, and Afghanistan, massive amounts of public funds are siphoned off by corrupt officials, leaving little for essential services like education, healthcare, and infrastructure. In Iraq, for instance, billions of dollars in oil revenues have disappeared into the pockets of political elites and warlords, leaving much of the country without reliable electricity, clean water, or functional healthcare. Education, or the lack thereof, is another critical factor. Many Muslim-majority countries, particularly in Africa and South Asia, have struggled to provide quality education to their populations. Low literacy rates, poor access to education for girls, and underfunded schools are significant barriers to economic development. In countries like Mali, where the literacy rate hovers around 30%, the lack of education limits the ability of people to improve their economic prospects. Furthermore, the lack of investment in higher education and scientific research means that these countries are often left behind in the global knowledge economy. While nations like Malaysia and Turkey have made strides in improving education, many others lag far behind, creating a significant development gap. Another factor is the role of religious conservatism and its influence on economic policy and social norms. In some countries, strict interpretations of Islamic law and resistance to modernization have hindered economic progress. For example, Saudi Arabia's historical restrictions on women's participation in the workforce significantly limited its economic potential. While reforms in recent years have opened up more opportunities for women, the country still faces challenges in fully integrating half of its population into the economy. Similarly, in countries like Afghanistan, under the Taliban's control, women are effectively barred from working, receiving an education, or participating in public life, severely limiting the country's economic development prospects. Furthermore, many Muslim-majority countries are grappling with rapid population growth, which places additional strain on already fragile economies. High birth rates in countries like Pakistan, Egypt, and Nigeria mean that these nations must find ways to provide education, healthcare, and jobs for millions of young people. The inability to create enough jobs for this burgeoning population results in high unemployment rates, particularly among young people. This demographic pressure can lead to social unrest, as seen in the Arab Spring, where youth unemployment was a significant driver of protests. Another structural issue is that many Muslim-majority countries have not been fully integrated into the global economy. While some Gulf states have established themselves as key players in global oil markets, many other countries have been left out of global supply chains or relegated to the export of raw materials. Globalization has brought immense wealth to some parts of the world, but it has also widened the gap between rich and poor countries. Many Muslim-majority nations, particularly in Africa and parts of the Middle East, have struggled to attract foreign investment or develop industries that can compete on the global stage. In conclusion, the poverty in many Muslim-majority countries is not due to any inherent flaw in the religion itself, but is the result of a complex interplay of historical, political, economic, and social factors. Colonial legacies, political instability, corruption, reliance on natural resources, lack of education, and rapid population growth all contribute to the challenges these countries face. While some nations have managed to overcome these obstacles, Turkey, Malaysia, and parts of the Gulf region are examples of this, the broader Muslim world still grapples with poverty, underdevelopment, and inequality. The path forward will require significant reforms, investment in education and infrastructure, and the resolution of political conflicts to unlock the potential of these nations and improve the lives of their people.